Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight, celebrating the release of 2 new books from Chicago-based authors Betsy Burr and Karla Valenti. I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging that the land on which the bookstore is located is the occupied, unceded, seized territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami people. There are over 75,000 Indigenous people of many nations living in Illinois, and we strive to recognize and honor Native histories, literature, and communities. We encourage everyone to learn more about the land on which they are currently viewing this program from, and one place to start is by visiting native-land.ca. My name is Karla Nussbaum, and I work as the Outreach and Sales Liaison for Women and Children First. We are one of the last remaining feminist bookstores in the United States, so thank you for your ongoing support. Our physical bookstore is open, but you can also order a copy of Loteria, Long Road to the Circus, and more from our website at womenandchildrenfirst.com. You can also use the very convenient Buy a Book box located at the bottom of your screen. Events are a vital part of our store's mission, and if you're interested in learning more about our events each month, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter or check out our website. For example, coming up on November 4th, join us in celebrating the release of the 2nd edition of The Sisters Are All Right, Changing the Broken Narrative of Black Women in America by Tamara Winfrey Harris. Now, I have the privilege to introduce the authors who will be in conversation tonight. And as a reminder, you can ask questions using the Ask a Question feature, also at the bottom of your screen throughout, and they will answer those towards the end. Betsy Burr is the Collection Development Manager of the Evanston Public Library and the former Youth Materials Specialist of New York Public Library. Betsy reviews for Circus, served on the 2007 Newbery Award Committee, and her children's literature blog, A Fuse No. 8 Production, is hosted by School Library Journal. Her books include Funny Girl, an anthology of humorous stories, and the picture books Giant Dance Party and The Great Santa Stakeout. Her most recent book, Long Road to the Circus, had me laughing and enthusiastically wishing that I too could find my ostrich steed. Karla Valenti writes stories for and about kids, taking readers on journeys steeped in magical realism and philosophical questions. Her storytelling is heavily influenced by her Mexican heritage and layered with ideas and concepts she's picked up in her many travels around the world. Karla writes picture books. She's the creator of the My Super Science Heroes series. Loteria is her debut middle grade novel and was such a beautifully written and atmospheric world that simultaneously brought both fears and comfort, and it's the perfect read for this season. Loteria and Long Road to the Circus are both fantastic stories that center young girls, Clara and Suzy, as they face off against destiny to figure out if they have the choice and capacity to forge their own paths. And while those paths are very different, I found joy in their shared sense of determination and hope. I am so excited to hear the conversation tonight. So without further ado, Betsy Burr and Karla Valenti.
Yay. I love how you threaded those together. That was brilliant. That was really good.
Thank you.
It was like primo moderation. It was wow.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. How you doing, Karla?
I am well. How are you, Betsy?
I am doing quite well as well. Very well indeed. So I think, should we give like the roundabout, like what we're going to be doing for this particular talk? So
yeah, I'll let you take the lead on that.
Okay, this is the problem because I like to moderate the library, so I'm just like, I'll be in the moderation chair now. No. So what we're going to do is we will both talk about our books, where they came from. We'll read chapters from them. We'll ask each other's questions. And then if people would also like to ask questions, we can let them as well. So, and because I have grabbed the moderation mic, the virtual moderation mic, the hypothetical moderation mic, I am going to ask you to begin by saying, where did your book come from? Tell us the whole backstory. I want the backstory.
Oh, you tricked me into that.
Oh yeah, sneaky.
So my book Loteria is actually based well, two things. One is at the core of this book is a fundamental question. And the question is one of free will. Do we have the power to make our own choices? Or is everything predetermined for us and we are just hurling on the way to our inevitable fate? And I had been exploring this question for many, many years, and I wanted to find a good forum to allow kids to explore this question as well without getting deep into the weeds of predeterminism versus free will. And so for many years, I had been trying to find a good game because I had this idea of a girl trapped in a game and she didn't know she was trapped in the game, and what would that mean for her and what kind of choices would she make and how would that shape her life. And I kept testing out different games. I thought about video games, which seems perfect given the era, but I'm not a gamer, and so it was just not something I could talk about. And then I was living in Germany at the time. I hadn't been home to Mexico in probably 4 years. And my dad came to visit and he brought a set of loteria. It's a card game, a little bit like bingo. And actually my illustrator did a gorgeous job of drawing 2 loteria tablas, which are like it's a card that has the grid, 16 icons, a little bit like bingo when you imagine how you've got all your numbers. But instead of numbers, you have pictures. And so the game began to unfold in front of us as we played it. And I thought, wait a second, this is a perfect game. It's a game of chance. And the way that I set it up is I have life and death coming into town. Every year they come together to play this game of chance called Loteria. And what's nice about it is that as you flip the card, instead of calling out a scorpion or a rose or a deer, there's a riddle. And you have to say the riddle and the people have to guess what it is. And the riddle is as much a part of the game as the cards, because you can use the traditional riddles, but you can also invoke your poet and come up with whatever riddle you think fits with that card and get people to guess it. So long story short, the inspiration for the book was a combination of this philosophical idea that I had been exploring with the very timely arrival of my father, who brought this card game of Loteria to our house. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, that's it. That's how this story is going to unfold. We're going to have this game playing, and each one of these cards is going to unfold as an event in my heroine's life. So anyway, that's a very roundabout way to answer your question. But I will put the same question to you. And how did you come up with your story? Especially because, as I understand it, this is based on a true series of events. And you sort of stumbled upon it. And there's like an interesting David Small connection in there too.
There is an interesting David Small connection. You're very right. And I should say, the Calvin and Hobbes in me loves the philosophical. Yes, the story begins when my grandmother's no good uncle would skip out on his farm chores to walk several miles to a different farm where there was an ex, I have to say this a certain way because other people go, ooh, like, no, an elderly ex-circus performer lived there, Madame Marantette, and he went there to train the horses to do circus tricks. This was a family story. Nobody believed it. Nobody believed there was a Madame Marantette, whatever. Fast forward years later, my mom's working in a bookstore. David Small, he came in regularly, and he happens to mention as one does, because he was my local illustrator. He drew for my class. He lives in the old Marantette house, and my mom goes, and she starts doing some research, and lo and behold, there was a Madame Marantette. She does to this day hold the high jump record on a horse while riding side saddle, and she has a record where a horse and an ostrich were trained to pull a surrey together. She owned a weirdly, venomously mean ostrich named Gaucho. So that was all interesting. I hear this, I tuck it away, and then I think, what if I did a book, and it was a picture book, and it was this story, and it was illustrated by David Small, which I proceeded to write up. I changed this, the story a little bit. Stars technically she would be my grandmother's older sister, Suzy. And she wants to get out of small town Burr Oak, Michigan. She figures there's a nearby celebrity. I'm going to find out how she got out, and I'm going to follow in her footsteps. And she determines that the number one way to get out of town, naturally, is to learn how to ride an ostrich side saddle. So, problem solved. Not so much. And I wrote it as a picture book, gave it to David. David was like, I see it as a novel. I was like, wrote it as a novel, and by gum, he liked it very much. And that's how we got the book. Yeah.
So what I love how the premise of it is a story that you're like, I don't think that's true. And then it turned out to be super true.
And then I made it not true.
Yeah, no, right. And I can completely relate to that because I grew up with a family of storytellers / liars, depending on how you define storytellers. And there were so many stories that were told, and I would just sit there and I'm like, I just don't think that's true. It just, how is it possible that my grandmother came to you in a dream and told you where she hid the earrings that she set aside for me? And yet the earrings are in this secret compartment behind the wall, behind the dresser that nobody knew was there. And then you're like, oh, well, maybe there's a little bit of truth to this story that I just heard you tell me. But I love that because there's so much magic hidden in our family legacy. And I don't mean just yours and mine. I mean, all families, right?
Oh,
we
sure.
all have those little stories.
Have you ever taken family stories and put them in your own books? Are there any family stories in your
book? So the one I'm writing now has a ton of them.
Yay.
But this one actually, this is interesting because I was asked at some point to talk about magical realism versus fantasy. Mm-hmm. And magical realism, again, this is my interpretation because it varies, but magical realism takes place in the real world, your ordinary day-to-day town, your ordinary day-to-day life. And there's an element of the fantastical that's just incorporated into the world. It's not treated as unusual. We're not talking Harry Potter with spells that not everybody can do. This is just part and parcel of living where you live, right? And, life and death, walking down the street. Of course they are. That's just how it is in Oaxaca, right? And so growing up, my whole life was magical realism. Stuff would happen all the time. And I just took it as true. My house had spirits in it, of course. And when I was a little kid, I love telling the story because this happened for real. We found this little stone. It was a beautiful pink stone, just random. And my dad's like, we should bury that in the backyard. So we do. And we check it every day for like a week and a half. And then one day we bring down the shovel and we bury out the stone to see what's there. And 3 diamonds pop out where this stone had been buried. Of course. And we look at them and at no point did anybody say, I don't know how these diamonds go. We were like, yes, of course there are 3 diamonds that were generated from a pink stone that we buried. And that was just accepted as life. So to answer your question, the whole book is basically my stories, right? Because I just felt like living my life was an exercise in magical realism come true. But yeah, it's easy to kind of slip into that mindset, right? Yeah.
Well, and now I want to hear it. I want to hear you read your book. And I have the power to share my screen. And we'll see if it actually works. All right, so I'm sharing. Or at least I'm telling it to share.
I believe you. I want to believe you.
Maybe it doesn't want, maybe it wants this. Ooh, interesting. Let's try that. Oh, it wants that instead. Okay. Tell me if you can see. Oops. Can you see your book?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. I was supposed to get it a little better set up. I thought I had it on the right page, but I didn't. All right. Why don't you read a little of your book?
So, in which life and death arrive and a girl's destiny hangs in the balance. Life sauntered into town on a wave of heat. He looked quite dapper in his black suit and matching vest, with a crisp white shirt and the tiniest hint of red peeking out of his jacket pocket, a crimson handkerchief monogrammed. His tall, short-brimmed hat provided little shade from the blinding white sky, and his walking stick left cracks on the dry and brittle land. The high-pitched whine of cicadas pestered him incessantly. Life raised his walking stick. With a tap, the stick opened into an umbrella that shaded him and his companion, a skeletal figure in a bright pink dress delicately embroidered with flowers and birds. A crown of roses rested on her skull. A few petals trailed behind her, plucked by a curious draft of hot air. "Shall we?" Life asked. "We shall," his companion replied, brushing dust off her sleeve. She may have been Lady Death, though she preferred to go by the name Katrina, but that didn't mean she was immune to the allure of beauty. Katrina placed her bony wrist clinking with gilded bangles upon Life's outstretched arm. Together they walked up to the main plaza in front of Santo Domingo Cathedral. "I wonder where everyone is," Life asked. "Taking shelter, no doubt," Katrina replied. It was the hottest hour of the day and the hottest summer anyone in Oaxaca City could remember. People burrowed deep inside their houses, shaded by massive branches of purple-flowered jacaranda trees. Exhausted fans made eddies of hot air saturated with lethargic mosquitoes and flies. The ceramic tile floors, usually so cool to the touch, radiated an infernal heat. Jugs of water steamed like pots on a stove. Katrina's bracelets rattled against her bone as she flicked her bangled wrist, spreading out a fan. Made of black lace and glinting with tiny white pearls, the fan was a gift from one of her admirers, of whom she had plenty. It had been left for her on one of the many marigold... Oh, there's Life and Death.
There's Life and Death.
One of the many marigold-covered altars that blossomed around the Dia de los Muertos celebration, which, by the way, is coming up, tucked between photographs of lost relatives and candied skulls. A note attached to the gift read, "Por favor, cuídalos." Of course I'll take care of them. Katrina watched over all her wards with a fierceness matched only by Life. "Well, let's get to it," Life said. "Let's," Katrina replied, and she began to fan herself. A cool breeze spread out from the black lace, a welcome relief in the searing heat. Strings of silver frost emanated from the fan, drifting out like so many wishes. Beneath their makeshift parasol, Life and Death followed the silver strands unfurling before them. They peeked into a doorway where a little boy played with a kitten in a box while his mother made a batch of tortillas to sell later in the day. The kitten meowed at the intruders, and the little boy looked up. He saw a handsome, well-dressed man and a beautiful woman with creamy brown skin and long dark hair. Life nodded at the boy, Katrina smiled, and the two companions moved on. Next, they passed a peeling wall painted with a faded mermaid clutching a basket of fruit. Bold letters above the mermaid spell the store's name, La Fruteria Sirena. It was run by a wrinkled man who'd been there longer than anyone could remember. The man and his wrinkles were fast asleep on a hammock strung up in the middle of the fruit shop. A strategically placed fan spun endlessly beside the slumbering man, its blades in a losing battle against the heat. Katrina took notice of the old man. His light was fading, and he would soon be joining her. But not today. They walked past La Rosa hair salon and the aptly named nursery La Maceta, the flower pot. Meaty cacti bursting with fruit stood sentry on either side of the door. Towering palm trees shaded the owner while he read a newspaper. At the end of the street, they approached a small church. Life gazed up at the brightly colored papel picado, paper cutouts tied from the bell tower to the lush trees surrounding the church. Each cutout depicted a scene of love. Crushed flower petals clung to the papers and stained the ground. "There was a wedding," Katrina said. "May the couple live long and well," Life replied, briefly bowing his head. The couple would indeed go on to live long and well, never knowing they owed their good fortune to the blessing of this strange visitor. But that is a story for another time. Katrina fanned herself again, sending out a new wave of silver strands. At that very moment, on another cobblestone street, a young girl in a small house with walls painted robin's egg blue looked up. With an urgency she couldn't quite explain, she turned her gaze toward the window. From her perch, the girl could just make out the twin crosses that crowned the cathedral's blue and white cupolas. A long white dove beat its wings against the hot sky. The girl rose and opened her windows. The church bells tolled. Clara, the girl's mother called. Come. A hint of cool breeze entered Clara's room. Hesitant at first, the breeze tentatively explored the confines of the space, just big enough for a child-sized bed, a 2-drawer dresser, and the girl herself. The breeze wrapped itself around the girl and tightly wove itself into her braids. A shiver ran down Clara's back, and she shook her head, trying to dislodge the breeze from her hair. She tugged at a stray strand of silver. Child, I need you, her mother called. I'm coming. Clara set down her sketch, a messy doodle of a horse with eagle's wings. Clara was not a good artist, and she knew that. Perhaps with more time and resources, she could develop this ability into an actual talent. As it was, she could sketch only on weekend mornings before her parents awoke. The rest of the time she spent in school, helping her parents run their small restaurant, La Casa de Juana. The restaurant had started off as just a few tables in the living room where Clara's parents liked to host dinners for friends. However, as word of Juana's talents in the kitchen spread, more and more tables were added. Their guests insisted on helping cover some of the costs of the food and preparation, and the living room was gradually transformed into a restaurant. Clara, her mom called. Okay, Clara called back and made her way to the kitchen. Juana was Clara's mother, and by all accounts, the best cook in Oaxaca. Her tamales were light and flavorful, wrapped in banana leaves. The cornmeal patties were stuffed with mole, corn, chicken, and black beans, or pineapples and raisins, then steamed and sold still hot to the touch. Juana also made the best tlayudas, large, thin, and partially toasted tortillas covered with a spread of beans, cheese, lettuce, and avocado, topped with beef, pork, seafood, or Clara's favorite, mushrooms. Juana's specialty dishes were many: tasajo, chorizo, cecina, guacamole, dozens of salsas. But what made La Casa de Juana truly special was the hot chocolate. Clara's mother had inherited the recipe from her mother, who had in turn received it from her mother, and she from her mother, and so forth for generations. At some point, Clara had taken it upon herself to sample hot chocolate from every vendor in the city, just to see if what people said was true. There was no contest. Her mother's combination of hand-ground cacao, almonds, cinnamon, and sugar was unmatched. She must have a touch of magic, the other vendors speculated, and their words felt as true as the sharp bite of cinnamon on Clara's tongue. Clara walked into their small kitchen to find her mother bent over a large ceramic saucepan, bubbling on the stove, surrounded by swirls of scents. A long wooden stick jutted up from the thick, dark mixture. The molinillo was a wooden whisk specially designed to yield the frothiest hot chocolate. Gracias, mija, Juana said. We're meeting with your cousins later today, and I need to pick up some things for the picnic. Can you keep an eye on this while I run to the mercado? Sure. Clara stepped up to the stove. What's that in your hair? Juana asked. Clara looked down at her braids and marveled at the dozens of thin, silvery strands interlaced with her own dark strands of hair. She pulled at the ribbons at the end of her braids, loosening the plaits. Her hair spilled out, releasing the silver strands. She watched them slip gently to the ground. Strange, Clara said, retying her hair. But the deed was done. She'd been chosen. Clara took the molinillo from her mother. I won't be long, Juana said. Okay. Don't stop stirring that, Juana added, giving Clara a stern look. It'll burn. As she stepped outside, Juana stumbled over a bottle at the threshold of her house, discarded the previous evening by a drunken man. Had the bottle not been there, Juana would have noticed the pack of stray dogs sitting quietly beneath Clara's window, and she would have remarked on the unusual flowers that had suddenly sprouted along the wall of the house, and she surely would have paused at the sight of a festively clad woman on the arm of an impeccably dressed gentleman, watching her from across the street. But Juana saw none of that. Not that it would have made a difference. It's settled then, life said. And so it is, Katrina agreed, gathering the silver strands of frost that had in one instant changed Clara's fate forever. Dun, dun, dun.
Oh, that's so good. Oh, I just love it. It's so good because it really just brings up. Did I stop sharing or are you still?
Yeah, that's good. We're good.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, it just does such a great job of introducing all the characters and what I mean, the whole fate, and it's all wrapped up in there. And it hasn't introduced the game yet, but the game is just on the edges, and it's sort of been hinted at in some ways. And it's so good, so fun to hear. I really enjoy it.
All right, well let's hear a chapter, your first chapter.
All right, so I'll do my first chapter. And I'm getting better at this, so let me try it like this. There we go. There we are. But now I've like moved it in such a way where I can't get it back. So let's see. There we go.
I want our audience, the illustrations are so wonderful. So I want our audience to pay particular attention because he captured the gaucho especially so well.
Gaucho, yeah, Gaucho's right. I like this because when I sign the book, I get to make him go meep meep like the Roadrunner.
Yes, that's perfect.
The only time that a ostrich has ever been compared to a Roadrunner. Okie dokie. Chapter 1. Strongest grip in a girl I ever saw, Daddy said, not without some pride. I looked down at my palms, rubbed raw where earlier I'd clung to the elm tree in our front yard with my no good, stinking brother Bill pulling on my leg to get me down. He'd called me in for mealtime, and I didn't want to jump to obey his word, so there'd been a good 5 minutes of yanking and gripping before Daddy put a stop to it. I still wasn't feeling anything in 4 of my fingers, but his praise was a cool, clear solve to those burning digits. A solve, that is, until Mama chimed in with, just like the day she was born. Once she said that, no amount of moaning on my part could derail her from telling the legend of baby Suzy. And believe me, I tried. Changing the subject didn't amount to anything. Lying about our cow going into labor didn't do any good. Possibly because she wasn't pregnant at the time. Ignoring my petulance, Mama launched right in. The day you were born, Lamp Eye, you gave me more trouble than I'd ever had with your sister and brothers. This was no small thing. Mama had 3 kids before me, and according to her, each one had been a trial. I thought I knew all the ins and outs of birth, but you gave me a real ride. You just didn't want to leave. You were holding on for dear life to keep from meeting the world. Then she began to laugh. My mama cannot talk about the day I was born without bursting into giggles. Granny says it's unseemly. That means whenever she gets to the hilarious part, Granny will totter over and start poking her with her cane, which only sets my mama off further. Get a hold of yourself, woman, Granny says. Birthing babies is our war. And telling the stories of it means telling about all the bloodshed and battles we overcome. Ain't no time for tittering like a school child. Then she'll poke me once upside the head with the cane and say, you don't see this one acting the fool when you tell the tale. I don't think it much fair to get rammed in the head when I'm doing something she likes, but that's the way with Granny. Doing something right gets you 1 poke. Doing something wrong gets you a whole lot worse. Anyway, the reason I wasn't guffawing along with the rest of the family is because I've never found the story all that funny, and that's on account of how Mama ends the story. Finally, we get you out, and there you are, smaller than a coop's egg. This tiny little baby, all flailing limbs and wailing cry, looking half-starved, which is not the way a baby should be, but quick as lightning, you'd latched on and started drinking off me from the get-go. That's when we knew you would do just fine. A pause. Except nothing, I interrupted, not eager to hear any more. And I ate everything you ever put in front of me and stayed small, and that's okay, the end. Except, she continued, like she hadn't heard me, when your granny came in to take you so I could rest, and truth be told, I was pretty tired as well, we tried to dislodge your tiny baby hands from my hair and clothes and discovered a grip we'd never encountered before. Strongest thing I've ever felt from something that small. Could be you didn't try hard enough, Granny muttered to herself. Well, Mama shrugged at that. Well, I was plumb exhausted, I admit, she said. But the harder I tried, the harder you'd grip. Every single time, without fail, she'd start to laugh again. Laughing at the remembrance of laughing. So there's Granny, looming over me, trying to take the baby Suzy away, and I couldn't get you loose. And then suddenly, she snorted, which isn't ladylike, but at this point, she didn't care. I'm laughing too hard to dislodge you. And then Granny gives it a try, Daddy continued, because by this time, Grandmama was having a high old giggle fest and wasn't fit to talk. And she can't get you to let go either. I tried, Granny snapped. When as soon as you got one hand undone, the other one would snake up and grab whatever was in reach. She glared long and hard at me, like she was doing it on purpose. Not having anything to say to that, I said nothing. Now Daddy was laughing too, along with my siblings. Even Bill was laughing, but that's because he's a nasty toad of a brother, and that look on his face wasn't because he found the story funny, but because he found my finding the story not funny. Funny. That makes sense? And then I tried to pull, Daddy said, and you just gripped your mama harder, and I thought we'd have to take scissors to the dress just to cut you off. And my hair, Mama cackled. Oh, they're a regular funny troupe, my family. I stood to leave, but Mama's hand shot out and grabbed me, and if there's any question of who I get my grip from in this family, they just need to feel that vise. You go nowhere. The thing is, she said, calming down slowly and looking at me with real love, I knew then that you were going to be one of my best and biggest problems, right from the start. Knew it like I knew your pretty face. Because my girl's the kind who never lets go of something when she wants it. Never. Any fool can grip, Granny spat. It's the smart ones that know when to let go. Well, there you have it. My name is Suzy Bowles, and I've never known when to let go a day of my life.
Betsy, when I first read that chapter, I was so blown away by the voices, and you read them exactly how they sound in my head. So yay. But how did you do that? Each one of those characters is so unique. Each one has its own personality. Everybody, there's no jumbling. You know exactly what they sound like. You know what Granny looks like. You know what the brother looks like. So are these real people in your life, or did you make them up?
See, this is what goes back to what I was saying about, like, do you incorporate stories? So this is just family stories. This story was not a family story, I should say. I made this one up. But there's a lot of family stories in this book that I just right off stole. So we're all, I don't know if Bill the nasty toad of a brother was an actual person, but the dad and the mom and the granny, those were all like my ancestors. My ancestors? Yeah, that's the word for it. Yeah, so that was my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother in there. And I didn't know them. I've never met them, but I just always had sort of like a picture in my mind of what they'd be like. And photos, you have the old family photos where everybody, like, they can't smile or they're going to die. Because it was like that's what they had the photos from. And I figured they had to have a sense of humor somewhere. So, I don't know. Sometimes when you write, it's like you're like trudging uphill in the snow and the words aren't coming and it's painful. And then sometimes you write and it's just like water off your fingertips. It's like boo, 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 boo. It's like the easiest thing in the entire world. And it was the latter in this particular case. It was not difficult.
And it's interesting because we borrow from ourselves and our life and our family and our friends. But I found that when I was writing Loteria, I needed to put Clara and Esteban, her cousin, into some really scary situations. And I had to be okay with that. And as an author, I wasn't okay with that if these were my family members. And so
exactly.
I actually had to separate any traits that were recognizable and create these characters that were completely unique so that I could make them suffer, which, it seems so contrary, but without that suffering, the story kind of falls flat. And so I had to kind of liberate them in order to write this book.
That makes so much sense because they're always like, kill your darlings. But this is like you can't have an actual person.
Exactly.
I'm the same way. And, you put your characters through some like major stuff. Like my book, I'm just going to spoil it for you people. Nobody dies.
No, don't spoil it.
I'm sorry. There's not even like a hint that anyone's going to die. Like nobody dies. And I tell the kids, like, maybe someday I'll kill somebody in a book, but I think you're at a level that I have not. I'm not saying if anyone dies in your book, but I'm saying that you can put threats to your characters that I aspire to someday doing that. But the problem is, and this is something my mom always said about like watching the Harry Potter films. She's like, I just want to see a film where like there aren't any bad guys and they just like get to hang out all day and we get to watch that. I'm like,
does she though, really?
Do you really? I don't know if you do.
Because there's just the hero rises from the challenge, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, of course, those stories are great, but really we fall in love with these characters who fall off ostriches, who go into these places that are really scary. And even if you know or hope they don't die,
Mhm.
just watching them overcome that struggle is what makes them relatable. Because, okay, fine, I've never been on an ostrich. I probably never will, but I know exactly how she feels. I know that desire to get away. I know that desire to do something no matter how much it hurts, right?
Mhm.
And if we don't see the characters actually doing that, then there's this connection that we don't really establish with them.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
But you have an extra added difficulty that you've put on because you go into a fantasy world. There is a fantasy world. I have the name, but I wrote it down over here.
Adrian.
That's it.
It's actually a word jumble of my name, Arenas.
Oh, that's clever.
Surprise!
That's a good one. But you have to have believable, relatable characters in extraordinary, fantastical settings, which that seems really hard to me. Like that would be like another level of, especially if some of the characters that they're meeting are not in fact human, and yet you have to not necessarily relate to them, but you have to sort of see where they're coming from sometimes. So that just seems like that's what fantasy like seems so much harder in some ways to me than realistic or historical.
Yes and no. And it's funny that you say that, because I actually have a harder time staying placed in the real world, because you have to abide by real rules that I don't always like. Whereas in fantasy, you get to make up stuff and you can be like, you know what, in this world, yeah, you can fly. Yeah, and in this world, you know, you can have giant spiders and you can draw something and it becomes real. And, you know, and so it just gives you that freedom. But I guess by the flip side, it all has to, you still have rules, you've just made them up. So everything has to work within that world, and it has to make sense within that world, or else the whole thing sort of collapses.
That's true. It has its own internal logic that makes
Exactly. Yeah.
We have a question here, and I must ask it myself because I have a follow-up question to it. Is this recipe for the hot chocolate real? I can practically taste the chocolate. Follow-up question: you have a chocolate and is it cinnamon tasting fruit? Is that real?
Yeah. Okay, so that's funny because that's kind of an Easter egg. I put it in there and it's not real. All the other plants in there are real. But I plopped that one in there, and my dad was like, people are gonna think it's real. And I'm like, well, there you go. It isn't. But how amazing would it be if it was? Wouldn't that be great?
I would know. I was like, I almost Googled it and I was like, it's probably not real.
I know.
I think
the hot chocolate recipe is real. And I actually, as I was writing the book, I sent out a call to my family, some of whom I think are watching, so thank you. But I sent out a call. I said, I need a hot chocolate recipe. And my grandmother was a bakeress, and she was amazing. She made these gorgeous cakes and, of course, hot chocolate. So immediately my dad sent me a recipe. He said, this is the hot chocolate that I used to have when I was a kid. And it was just handwritten. Like it was like a copy of my grandmother's handwritten recipe on an index card. And as I started to read it and interpret it, I was like, this is actually a recipe for chocolate frosting with added milk. And I can see why it was amazing, because who wouldn't want to drink chocolate frosting? But it's amazing. It's delicious. Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's very good. Bree had a question for us as well. Are your characters inspired by anyone in your life?
So I'll let you answer first, because you have a lot of characters.
I do, and they're inspired by dead people.
Yeah, that counts.
I don't think there's a single person in my book who's still living today that they were inspired by, which makes it very easy to write.
Yeah.
They don't come up to you and be like, "Why'd you write me like that?" So I learned my lesson there. Unfortunately, I forgot my lesson because I am currently writing a book that is based on like everyone I knew when I was 12, but like merged with other people, and they're going to be so mad at me.
You're gonna be getting some calls.
There's one character who's like a combination of my best friend growing up and my roommate when I studied overseas, and a girl he used to come to the first library I ever worked in after school, and I just slammed them all together, and none of them were going to be happy with what the end result. But
That's, well, I mean, you have to, right? Some people are just that interesting. That's what you say to them. It's like, you are so interesting. I had to put you in a book, right?
Right. How about you? Is there anyone in your book?
No, not anyone in particular, but sort of the relationships are inspired by my relationships with my family. So family is really, really important. And I wanted to build that into the story. And I wanted that to be a central theme that, family gets together, family supports each other, family is there for family. When Esteban, Clara's cousin, he disappears, she goes after him because yes, it's family. You will go to the ends of the world for family. So it was things like that where thematically I added those traits to my characters, but there's not a specific person. Because again, I didn't want to hurt anybody that I love, and I couldn't write this story without hurting these characters.
Yeah, exactly. Why did you kill me off?
Exactly.
Yeah, sweetie. It's just how it goes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, which in some way, I guess if somebody, maybe if somebody isn't so nice to me, I'll kill them in my next story, right? Because I can do that. I can put them in a really bad place and just be like, you should have been nicer.
Therapy on the page. That's all.
Exactly.
Yeah. We've got a very good question here. It says, what was it like to collaborate with an illustrator on your characters and story? And do you have a favorite illustration? I'm just going to plug that up here. I do. There's Kyle Lukoff, who has Too Bright to See, which is a current National Book Award finalist.
I saw that. Yeah.
Very good. Kyle gets a tattoo of an illustration from each one of his books, which I think is a level of dedication to the craft of your illustrator. Also, you better like your illustrators because you're going to,
So are you going to get gaucho?
Yeah, there's
on your body.
I love, but I will tell you what. So if I were to get a tattoo, it would be this picture. Now, the reason I love this picture is, yes, gaucho looks fantastic, very good. However, it's the legs. It's the legs of the little man who's been thrown off. I don't know why. David Small. So it was weird during COVID. David would work on this book, and then he would send the pictures to me, and we went back and forth. And you're not supposed to interact with your illustrator, but whatever, man, it was freaking COVID. And so he would say things like, I want to put chickens at the beginning of the chapter. Can you add in some chickens? And I'll be like, adding chickens. So that was awesome. But when he sent me this image, it's just like some of his images, I was like, yeah, that's good. But then that one, I was like, that's the best. But
you know what? I think you raise a really good point about collaborating with illustrators, because even in picture books where there are so many illustrations, most middle grade novels don't have a ton of illustrations.
Usually both of ours do, which is interesting.
Right. Yeah. And I found that to be so rewarding and so enhancing of the story. And same with yours, because it just adds another dimension. And so I love to be able, I love to hear, right, that David's like, I'm going to put chickens in, and then your story changes to incorporate that. And it really feels like a collaboration, not just somebody drawing something really pretty, but they've elevated it and added their own stamp to that story. And that just enriches it completely. Yeah. I was very lucky with Dana Sanmar, who is the illustrator for Loteria. And Dana is a Colombian, she's a Colombian illustrator, and she actually does, it's hard to explain, but it's a 3D model that she built of the cover. So it wasn't done digitally. It wasn't even that it was painted. It was assembled. And on my website, I have a video that she sent, just a little clip, but you can actually see it's like glued, like pieces of paper that were cut and glued to build a model, right? And like the detailing, right? And then she scanned it, and then it's digitalized. But to me, just seeing that, I thought was a wonderful way to capture the papel picado concept. Mm-hmm. And then just a very unique art form. My favorite illustration is the cover, because I think she did a phenomenal job of capturing both the feeling of just fate and your life being out of your hands completely. Mm-hmm. You're swept away by whatever destiny throws your way, but then also a measure of control. She's holding a card. She's staying in place. the color scheme, the groundedness of Clara was just a perfect way to represent free will versus fate. And that sums up the entire theme of the book.
Yeah, and when I was a kid reader, I would always look at like the cover of the book and be like, is this scene in the book? And
Exactly.
also I'd be like, did the illustrator actually read the book? Often with these books where the art is only on the cover and there's no interior art, like you sometimes get the feeling like you didn't read the book, did you?
Right.
But some illustrators, only do covers, like Brandon Dorman, and he read like the whole, because there's like all these little tiny details that only happen in like page 295. It's always like, ooh, yes, well,
right, which is great. I mean, that again, it's encapsulating the story in a different format. And I mean, to that point, we have a spider here.
Oh, I didn't notice the spider.
Right? I know. And I didn't notice it the first time I saw it, the second, the third, and then all of a sudden, boom, there was the spider, who obviously is a central character.
Yeah, if you weren't scared of them before, this book will do it for you.
Yeah, that one and the scorpion. I get a lot of feedback about those too.
Oh yeah, the scorpion. Yeah. The scorpion, I don't know, I guess there seems to be some intent there, but I don't know. You can interpret it either way, I think. Yeah. Oh, we have a good one here. What were the hardest and easiest scenes to write and why? Ooh. All right. I think I had to think about this one, and I think I know the answer. It was actually okay. So I had to figure out how to write a novel when David Small said, "Make it a novel," and I was like, "Never done that one before." Okay, and I'm like, "Oh shoot! Now I got to figure out a plot." Because as far as I'm concerned, if I could just write dialogue the entire time, you can kind of see that in the first chapter. I'm like, dialogue, plot, yeah, dialogue. Well, I had to come up with a plot. I had to come up with the climax of the book. I had to come up with an ending. Like, what's the big moment at the end of the book? And so the hardest chapter for me was not the last chapter. The last chapter I knew. I was like, oh yeah, I know exactly how it ends. But I had to get there. I had to deserve it to a certain extent.
Right.
And so it was chapter 24. Chapter 24. Betsy's existence. Chapter 24. Yeah, I had to. It had to be reworked a little. It came pretty much in its final form, but there was definitely a bit of tweaking to it. So yeah, it's that's what's hard for me.
Well, yeah, I mean, the climax is always hard because it's where your character has to learn their big truth, face it, and change. I mean, it's everything. Mine was exactly the same. The climax was so hard, and in part because I had thrown so much challenge and suffering at my characters that I basically pushed them up against the wall and put them in an impossible situation. And I was like, I don't know how they're going to get out of here. And so I sort of like, you think as an author that you're in control, that if you do the meta free will versus fate, right? My characters don't have free will. I am completely designing their story, except I got to this point and I'm like, nope, no clue. I'm out of ideas. And at the same time, I had been writing this debate between between life and death about free will versus fate. And they had great arguments on both sides. And I never wanted one to be more meaningful or to be a clear win. And so they get to this point that coincides with the climax where they've kind of debated themselves into a conundrum. So now I'm like, all right, so on both paths, both the philosophical and the plot one, I don't know how to get out of here. And then that I was stuck. I'm like, I'm almost at the end of the book. I know where I want to go, but I can't get myself there. And fortunately, having let Clara go and let her do her own thing, she came up with this answer. It was just like, what about ding? And I wrote in what she said. And it was like, that's it. That's how we answer the plot. And that's how we answer the question of free will. So thank you, Clara, right? And just I gave her free will and she sort of resolved the whole thing for me. And then I was able to go on. And I remember this big feeling of relief because I was able to I'm like, okay, I'm going to finish the book now. I can do this. But that's a tough place to be as an author. as we should be, right? Because we also want to take our characters to this point where they really are forced into a transformation, and that does not come easily. I think you said as much, right? You have to earn it, and that's exactly what happens. Yeah.
I just like the idea that you are the author, so therefore you are the creator of both life and death in this book, who in terms are they're in, and they're controlling the humans below them, but you're above them, and and you don't know what they're gonna do necessarily. I mean, people always talk about this where like the character like walks in and says something, and you're like, well, I don't know why they said that, but I guess I have to go with it because that's what they said. Exactly. But it does happen. It does happen to a certain extent where you're like, okay, you're just going with this apparently. I don't even know. You have I always have a vague outline, like, I think we're going to go in this direction. And very rarely does a character go like, no, but once in a while it happens. So. Well,
and you like yes, but also there are these moments, right? These plot points where you're just stuck. You're not quite sure how you're going to get past them. And in this case, the Loteria game actually played a really great role, because when I would get stuck, I would flip a card, and whatever that card was, I would force myself to write that scene using that card. And some of my favorite scenes were developed that way. The scorpion came up that way. The rose came up that way. The king came up that way. And the king plays such an important role in the story.
Kind of like a major character. So
And he didn't show up until almost the very end in one of these like card flips. And then I thought, this is really important. So then I went back and sort of built in his appearance a little bit earlier. But I mean, it just goes to show that even when you think you know what you're doing and that you think you're in control, sometimes, there are surprises there still that allow you to take your story in an unexpected direction. Yeah.
All right. I think we have time for one more question here. And this is fun. It says familial obligation, quote unquote, and duty play a role in both books in very different ways. How did their family roles influence their paths? And that's a very good question.
Wow, that's a very smart question.
I like that a lot. And it's true. The family in this book, I had a difficulty. I had to get my main character to want desperately to leave them, but also love them. That's a tricky balance, because it's very easy to get your heroine to have horrible family members, and I did put one horrible family member in there, 1.5. I put 1.5 horrible family members, but generally speaking, this is a pretty loving family. They might have rules she doesn't agree with, but they definitely care about her. That was, interestingly enough, those are the scenes that I think I wrote them during COVID, actually, because I had gotten the thing, but then we needed to have a little more like, what about the family? Let's hear a little more about the family. So there were some additional family scenes that I put in there, but at the same, so there is a lot of obligation to the family, especially if you're in a small town, if you're on a family farm, and family farm. The more kids you have, the more hands you have to work on the farm, because that's just a practical use of the bodies that are available to you at a certain point. And so there is that sort of that understanding. But at what point does that obligation to the family carry on into adulthood or into teenagerhood? Like, where does that fall? At what point can you break away and do your own thing? But remember, this is 1920 small town Michigan. Breaking away for young women at the time, very difficult, very hard, not an easy thing to do. In this book, it involves an ostrich. In real life, it involved running away to Detroit. So, very different, but it happens.
But what you did really well is that, I mean, it's interesting to hear you say this, because even though she's desperate to escape, it's always clear that she loves her family, right? There's never a moment where you're like, oh, she wants to escape because they're not awful, but even she recognizes this tension between wanting to stay and needing that. And even the way she talks about her brother and how they do have certain moments of alliance, there's depth there, right? And that's very important to make the story work.
That's true. And yourself?
So in my case, I guess very similarly, right? The role of family is a grounding force that frees Clara to go on this adventure. That first it binds her to Esteban, which is the impetus behind the adventure, but also it gives her, I think, that comfort, that knowledge that she's not alone, even as she goes through these things. She's carrying, you know, the feeling, the sentiment, the family inside her that gives her the courage to do the things that she needs to do. So they're always there in the background. It's always part of, you know, who she is. So for instance, it's really important for her to keep her promises, right? And that's something she's learned from her family. And that's something that she values because it matters to her family. And so, but that's central to her, and that saves her in the end. And, you know, so that's a role of family that's kind of an indirect one, but always present.
That's true. And actually, there is a comment in the side here from a young reader who was asking, why did Katrina invent the game?
So Katrina didn't invent the game. They just play it. Life and Death play the game. The game is invented. The game was actually invented. Fun fact. The game was invented by a French manufacturer during the Mexican Revolution. And he would actually create labels for products, like for canned goods. And so then when these goods would be shipped to the front line for the soldiers, he made these boards, these tablas and the cards of loteria, and they would send them with the packaging. So the soldiers would have something to play while they were just sitting around waiting for war. And then when the soldiers came home, they brought these games with them for their families, and the families liked them and played them. And it just became a part of the culture. And so it has this really interesting history to it, but it's not quite that Katrina and Life invented it. And I'm not really going to tell people where they found the game or why, because that's another story for another time.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
yeah.
Good. All right. Well, thank you. It was just delightful. It was fun. And I'd like to thank everyone for showing up. And I will now invoke a bookseller to join us at this point.
Well done.
I'm very talented. I don't want to brag.
And I want to thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation and for joining us tonight. Just so everybody knows, the video will be available to view again at this link after the event ends, and with closed captioning on YouTube shortly as well. So feel free to share far and wide. Also, as a reminder, you can buy the books on our website, and that is the best way to support both the authors tonight and your local feminist bookstore. I can't wait to get these books into the hands of young people. Thank you both so much for attending. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye.
No.